The night my son had me arrested, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just a steady, cold November rain that made everything look gray and tired. I remember standing on my own porch in my bathrobe, watching two officers walk up the front steps and thinking, this isn't real. 63 years old, 31 years with the county assessor's office, never so much as a parking ticket. Mr. Hargrove, the younger one said, "That's me. We need you to come with us, sir." Behind them, at the edge of my driveway, I could see my son's car, a black Audi, one I had never seen before. And standing next to it, my daughter-in-law. She had her arms folded across her chest, and she was watching me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. I didn't resist. I got in the back of the patrol car in my slippers and rode 20 minutes to the station in the rain, thinking the whole time about the last conversation I'd had with my son. 3 weeks earlier, he'd asked me again when I was planning to update my will. I'd said I wasn't in any rush. He'd gone quiet in a way that I told myself meant nothing. At the station, they put me in a room and told me to wait. I waited. Then the door opened, and a man in a suit walked in, late 50s, silver hair, the kind of posture that comes from decades of being the most important person in whatever room he's standing in. He looked at me, and his face changed. "Gene," he said. Just my name, like he'd been looking for me. His name was District Attorney Leonard Pruitt. We worked together for 11 years on county property valuation disputes, before he moved up. I testified in 3 of his cases. He'd come to my retirement dinner 4 years ago and given a toast that made my late wife cry. He turned to the officer behind him and said, "Who filed this complaint?" "The son, sir, Franklin Hargrove." Leonard looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Give us the room. I need to back up. Because if I'm going to explain what my son did, I have to explain what my son did. I have to explain what I had. Not a fortune. I want to be clear about that. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist and a school librarian. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable, and I never forgot what it felt like to watch my father count change at the grocery store. So when I finally had something, a paid-off house, a modest retirement account, a small rental property in Springfield that my wife and I bought in 1987 for $42,000, I held on to it carefully. I was not careless with money. When my wife Patricia passed from ovarian cancer in 2019, I inherited her portion of the rental property and a life insurance payout. All told, with everything, I was sitting on roughly $1.2 million. I know that sounds like a lot, but I was 63. I had no pension outside of Social Security and a 401k. And I intended to live another 30 years if my knees cooperated. I have 2 children, my daughter who lives in Portland with her husband and teaches middle school science, and my son, Franklin, who is 40 years old and works in commercial real estate, or did until recently. Franklin is smart. I want to say that because it matters. He is genuinely intelligent, charming, the kind of man who walks into a room and within 10 minutes knows everyone's name. His mother adored him. I adored him. There's a photo on my refrigerator of Franklin at 9 years old, standing on a dock in Michigan with a fishing rod, grinning like the world was a gift somebody left for him personally. I look at that photo now and I don't know what to do with it. His wife. I'll call her Cassandra, because that's her name and she's earned having her name in this story. Came from money, not inherited money. The kind her family would let you forget about. New money. Loud money. The kind where the lifestyle is the point. She drove a car that cost more than my first house. She had opinions about wine. She called me Gene within the first month of knowing me, and I noticed that she never, not once in 6 years of marriage to my son, called me Dad. I don't think she ever intended to. It started small. That's what I keep coming back to. Not some moment where I should have seen everything clearly. Just small things, accumulating slowly, like water damage behind a wall. The first thing was the credit card. About 2 years ago, Franklin called and said he'd noticed some confusion on his taxes and asked if he could have access to my financial accounts to help me organize things. I was newly retired. I was still learning what I did, and didn't know about managing money on my own. Patricia had always handled the day-to-day finances. I said yes. He set up a shared access account. I didn't read the full terms. That's on me. 3 months later, I got a statement in the mail for a credit card I hadn't opened. A Visa with a $12,000 balance issued in my name to a mailing address in Columbus that I didn't recognize. When I called the number on the statement, the representative told me the account had been opened 6 weeks earlier, verified with my social security number and date of birth. I called Franklin. He said it was probably identity theft and I should report it immediately. He sounded concerned. He helped me draft the dispute letter. He offered to mail it for me. I found out later, much later, that he had mailed it directly into a trash can. By the time I understood what was happening, there were 4 cards. Combined balance just over $61,000. The rental property was the second thing. I'd been renting it to the same family for 9 years, a retired nurse and her adult daughter. Good tenants. They paid on the first of every month without exception. In the spring, about 18 months ago, I got a call from the nurse asking if I'd received the new lease she'd signed with my representative. I didn't have a representative. I drove to the property. The nurse showed me a lease agreement with my signature on it. A signature that was close enough to mine that I had to hold it next to my actual signature to see the difference. The lease had been modified. The rent had been reduced by $400 a month. The security deposit waived. And there was a clause I'd never seen before that gave the tenant right of first refusal if the property was ever sold at assessed value from 2019, which was substantially below current market. My tenants had dealt in good faith with someone they believed was acting on my behalf. They were victims too. I started making copies of everything I could find. I didn't tell Franklin. I didn't tell Cassandra. I went to a UPS store and made photocopies and bought a flash drive and started scanning documents at night at the library downtown because I didn't trust my own printer not to be monitored somehow. Maybe that sounds paranoid, but by then I'd started to understand that I was dealing with someone who was thorough. The third thing was the will. My attorney, a woman I'd used for 30 years since she was a young associate in her father's firm, called me in August to say she'd received a request from someone claiming to be my new legal representative, asking for a copy of my existing will and estate documents. She had declined, obviously, but she called me because she was worried. I drove to her office that afternoon. I sat across from her desk and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something I've always appreciated about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jean, how close is your son to needing money?" I said I didn't know. She turned her monitor so I could see it. She'd pulled a public records search while I was talking. Franklin's LLC, a company I'd known about, one he said was dormant, had 3 civil judgments against it, totaling about $230,000, filed within the last 14 months. I sat there and thought about the phishing photo on my refrigerator. Here's what I decided to do. And I want to be honest about this. I decided not to confront him. That goes against instinct. Every part of me wanted to pick up the phone and ask him directly, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Do you understand what you're throwing away?" But my attorney said no. She said the moment he knew I was aware, he would either accelerate his plans or start covering his tracks, and we needed more time. So I waited. I froze my credit, all 3 bureaus. I had my bank flag any unusual activity. I opened a new account at a different bank that Franklin didn't know about, and I started quietly moving assets, not hiding them, restructuring them legally the way you would do if you were doing legitimate estate planning. And I called Leonard Pruitt, not because he was the DA. I didn't want to make it official yet. I called him because he's known me for 20 years, and I needed someone who could tell me honestly whether what I was describing sounded like what I thought it sounded like. He was quiet on the phone for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Jean, I'm going to put you in touch with someone in the financial crimes unit. Don't say anything to Franklin. Don't change your behavior. Just document everything." I said I already was. He said, "Of course you are." The arrest happened before I expected it to. I think Franklin got nervous, or Cassandra pushed him. I'll never know exactly what the conversation was that made them decide to move when they did, but looking back, I think they'd figured out that I'd frozen my credit. That would have told them the window was closing. They reported me to the police for elder financial abuse against myself. The claim was that I had dementia and had been making erratic financial decisions, that Franklin had documentation of my confused state, and that he was applying for emergency guardianship to protect my assets. Emergency guardianship. I want you to understand what that means. If it had gone through, Franklin would have had legal control over every account, every property, every decision about my medical care and living situation. I would have been, functionally, his dependent, his prisoner, dressed up in legal language. The night they had me arrested was meant to be the first step in establishing a record of my erratic behavior. A confused old man picked up by police in his bathrobe. It would have looked bad. It would have looked exactly like what they needed it to look like. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Leonard Pruitt had been briefed 2 weeks earlier, that the Financial Crimes Unit had already opened a preliminary inquiry, that my attorney had a signed affidavit ready to file the moment any guardianship petition appeared in the court system, and that Leonard himself happened to be at the station that night on an unrelated matter when the duty officer flagged my name. When Leonard closed the door and we were alone in that room, he sat down across from me and said, "You okay?" I said, "I'm in my slippers." He almost smiled. "We're going to need you to be patient a little longer." How much longer? Not long. He was right. Within 72 hours of that night, a search warrant had been executed on Franklin and Cassandra's home in Dublin. That's a suburb of Columbus. The kind of neighborhood with a homeowners association and seasonal wreath rules. Investigators found 3 things that mattered: a laptop with records of the fraudulent credit card applications, a notary stamp that had been used to forge my signature on the modified lease, and a folder, an actual physical folder, containing what appeared to be a draft of a new will, one that left my daughter nothing and transferred everything to a trust that Franklin controlled. He hadn't filed it yet. Maybe he was waiting for the guardianship to go through. Maybe he thought he had more time. He did not have more time. Franklin was arrested on a Tuesday. I found out from my attorney, who called me at 7:14 in the morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out at the backyard, at the oak tree Patricia and I planted the year we moved in. It was November still. The tree was bare. She told me the charges: wire fraud, identity theft, forgery of legal documents, and filing a false report, the police report about my dementia, which is apparently its own crime in Ohio. Cassandra was charged with wire fraud and conspiracy. I said thank you and hung up. Then I sat there for a while. I'm not sure how long. I don't know what I expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or anger, finally allowed to come out. What I actually felt was a kind of hollowness, like something had been removed that I hadn't known was there. 40 years of being someone's father, 35 years of watching him grow up, watching him fail at things and try again, watching him become someone I thought I knew. And then this. My daughter flew in from Portland 2 days later. She sat at that same kitchen table and held my hand and didn't say much. She's practical, like her mother. She cried once, briefly, and then pulled herself together and asked what she could do to help. I told her I needed someone to help me figure out what to do with the credit card dispute. She laughed. It was the first time either of us had laughed in days. The trial was in March. Franklin hired a defense attorney who tried to argue that the financial activity was a misunderstanding, that he'd had my verbal permission to manage certain accounts, that the will draft was just a preliminary discussion document that was never intended to be filed. My attorney had the notary stamp. She had the fake address the credit cards had been mailed to, a P.O. box in Westerville registered to an LLC Franklin had created 18 months earlier. She had the records from his laptop showing the date and time each fraudulent application had been submitted. She had the lease agreement with the forged signature, and she had a handwriting expert who testified for 40 minutes about the specific way the forgery deviated from my actual signature. His defense attorney, to his credit, did not give up easily. It didn't matter. Franklin was convicted on all counts. Cassandra took a plea deal. She agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. She cried on the stand, which I found, if I'm being honest, almost impressive. She had made an art form of performing grief she didn't feel. My son was sentenced to 11 years. I sat in that courtroom and watched him hear the number. I watched his face. I don't know what I was looking for. Some sign of the 9-year-old on the dock. Something I recognized. His eyes found me briefly and then looked away. He did not apologize. Not in the courtroom, not in any of the paperwork, not in any communication I've received since. I've thought about whether I wanted him to, whether it would have changed anything. Honestly, I'm not sure it would have. There's a thing that happens after something like this. People want to ask you how you're doing, but what they really want to know is whether you've forgiven him. It's the question underneath every conversation. I can see it in their faces. Like forgiveness is the ending they need to hear to feel okay about the story. I'm 64 now. I still live in my house. I still have the rental property. I kept the same tenants, lowered the rent back to what it should have been, and added 6 months to their lease as an apology for the confusion. They sent me a card at Christmas. I still have the oak tree in the backyard. My son is in a federal correctional facility in Elkton, Ohio, about 2.5 hours from where I'm sitting right now. I have not visited. I'm not angry exactly. Anger would be easier, I think. What I feel is something more like grief, which is strange because he isn't dead, but the version of him I thought I knew. The one I raised, the one he used to call me on Sunday nights just to talk about baseball. That person either never existed or stopped existing at some point without me noticing. And I don't know which of those is worse. What I do know is this. I am still here. My accounts are mine. My house is mine. My name, my signature, my legal identity, mine. He did not take those things, though he tried. There's a photograph on my refrigerator of a 9-year-old boy on a dock in Michigan. I don't know what to do with it. I haven't taken it down. Maybe one day I will. Maybe one day I'll understand what it means to love someone and mourn someone who is still alive. Until then, I just keep going. That's what you do. You just keep going. People ask me if I'm okay now. I tell them yes, and I mean it. But okay doesn't mean what it used to mean. It used to mean comfortable, settled, not thinking about hard things. Now it just means I'm still standing. And honestly, at 64 in slippers, after everything that happened, still standing feels like enough. What Franklin didn't come from nowhere. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud, but I've thought about it long enough to say it plainly. People don't wake up one morning and decide to forge their father's signature. They get there slowly, through 100 small choices, to take the shortcut, to avoid the hard conversation, to let someone else's greed become their own. I don't know exactly when my son crossed that line, but I know that every step he took after crossing it made the next one easier. That's how it works. Not dramatically. Quietly. Until one day, you're registering a P.O. box in Westerville to receive fraudulent credit cards mailed in your father's name. And somewhere in your mind that feels almost normal. I think about what I could have done differently, and I come back to the same answer every time. I trusted without watching, not because I was naive. I'd spent 31 years in county government. I knew how people behaved when money was involved, but because I thought family was different. I gave Franklin access to my accounts because I didn't want to seem suspicious of my own son. That instinct, the one that says love means not asking questions, cost me $61,000 in fraudulent charges and almost cost me everything else. The lesson I carry from that isn't cynicism. It isn't trust no one. It's something more specific. Love someone fully and still pay attention. The two things aren't opposites. In fact, the people who love you most in this world are usually the ones watching most carefully. Patricia watched. She would have caught this years before I did. I know that without a doubt. What saved me, in the end, wasn't luck. It was two things I'd built over decades without ever thinking of them as protection, reputation, and documentation. Leonard Pruitt walked through that door at the station because I had spent 20 years being someone worth knowing, someone whose word carried weight. And when it came time to prove what Franklin had done, the evidence existed because I had been careful. Not because I suspected him, but because being careful was simply how I'd always lived. You do right by the details every day, not because you're preparing for a crisis, but because that's what integrity looks like in practice. Franklin will be in Elkton for 11 years. Cassandra took her plea deal and moved back to wherever she came from. I don't think about either of them as much as you might expect. What I think about more is the kind of person I still want to be. Not bitter, not closed off, not the man who got burned and spent the rest of his life proving he learned his lesson by trusting no one. That's not a life. That's just a different kind of prison. There is still a photo on my refrigerator of a 9-year-old boy on a dock in Michigan, grinning like the world was made for him. I haven't taken it down. Maybe one day I will understand why. Until then, I just keep getting up, making coffee, looking out at the oak tree Patricia and I planted together. It's still there. So am I.